Thank you both. I'll just add to the comment by Lord Adonis. As a quantity surveyor, I think there should be more quantity surveyors at the top of government, but you might disagree with that. Yeah, God help us, yeah. Right, amendments to standard forms of contract. Just some context. Some may never heard of Crown Commercial Service. We have around about 700 people. We buy common goods and services for the public sector. We have commercial experts in a range of categories. The savings that we deliver are either used to address budget constraints or go back into frontline services. Last year, 13 billion spent through our contracts and frameworks. Audited savings of 725 million, or about 5%, roughly split between wider public sector and central government. We're split into 4 pillars. We have corporate solutions, technology, people, and the most important one, buildings. I head up the construction part of buildings. I also spend a lot of time in Government Property Agency on their Hubs programme. So just in terms of buildings, the aspiration for Crown Commercial is to have an offering for wider public sector, central government across the whole asset life cycle. We have contracts and frameworks in place for FM and utilities and fuels, but we don't have very much at all in the way of construction. We've got a PM and design framework that was launched last May. And we also have a fit-out framework for the government hubs. But our intention is, in autumn this year, we'll have a modular buildings framework available, and next spring we have a construction works framework. In terms of construction, we're under no illusion that there are a lot of challenges in the industry that we're all aware of. High risk, market volatility, questionable auditors, etc., etc. There's also, unfortunately, bad practice, particularly in the way of late payment and inappropriate risk transfer. And Katie will speak a bit more about the inappropriate risk transfer. Conversely, there are huge opportunities. As an industry, 100 billion per annum. Public sector, the single biggest client, about 30%. It's 6.7% of GDP, and it employs 3 million people, so who wouldn't want to work in it? I've loved working in it for the last 30 odd years. So, in terms of what Crown Commercial will be doing, first of all, we're going to be demonstrating the client leadership that's been called for over the last few reports into construction. Given there have been 70 since 1934, client leadership is a huge part of it. So in terms of commissioners of projects, central government departments and wider public sector, we're going to be supporting them through the frameworks to deliver the government construction strategy. But we need to view clients much more widely, and I think the tier 1 contractors and some tier 2s also need to consider themselves as clients. Tier 1s and tier 2s enter into many more contracts than central government departments and wider public sector organisations, probably 30, 40 times as many. So whatever we do, we need that step down through the supply chain. And that's what we're going to be aiming to do on these frameworks. I think it's also fair to say that the client advisors, so project managers, cost consultants, also really need to help clients show that leadership. So just briefly, 3 things that we're going to be doing on our frameworks. First of all, we've torn up the Crown Commercial Framework Agreement, and we're going to be using the Framework Alliance contract for the reasons David set out at the start, to increase collaboration, channel demand, and hopefully get much more exposure to the pipeline. Secondly, we're going to be using, or clients can use, a range of standard forms of building contract, and there'll be strong recommendations that tier 1s and tier 2s use the appropriate forms of subcontract. And then thirdly, it will be unamended forms. That will be the basis of the framework. I will now hand over to Katie to explain a bit more about the work she in particular has been doing around Z clauses, JCT amendments, etc., etc.
Right. Thank you, Kevin. Good morning, everybody. I'd just like to say that when I put these slides together, it had a nice, sleek, black background, so sorry for the bright white. So where do we start? So there are probably 3 issues in government, or at the moment, I like to call them hot topics. The first is contract management. The second, inappropriate risk transfer. And the third is less of a problem and more of a solution, and it's the standardization and simplification of contracts. Now, all 3 of these are very much interlinked, so to focus on one, the others are inevitably affected. Today I'm going to talk more about the standardization and inappropriate risk transfer. And there's been a cross-government focus on creating or improving already out there standard forms of contracts across all sectors. And we know in construction there are widely used contracts such as NEC, JCT, PPC 2000. So if we have these contracts in place, what are our problems? Inappropriate risk transfer and simplification can sometimes seem like very large problems with intangible and difficult solutions. So where can we begin? Amendments to standard forms of building contracts, or in NEC terms, Z clauses. So I'd just like to say that 10 months ago I had no idea what a Z clause was, and now I practically close my eyes and dream about them, so thank you, Kevin. So the NEC definition of a Z clause is a secondary requirement for a specific project. And after the initial research phase, we collected amendments used across departments in the government and found that there was a confusion around the definition of secondary requirements. There was a lack of distinction between the amendments and more specific customer requirements. And so these departments thought of their requirements as unique, when in fact they were definitely standard. And in a hypothetical example, we had the Ministry of Justice, the Department for Work and Pensions, and the Ministry of Defence, all drafting the same clauses, but in completely different ways. So the common themes that we found from this research were that they were inconsistent in their format, often ambiguous and poorly drafted, and the problems in turn cascaded down through the supply chain. So what real effect does this have? As I'm sure you'll all know, it reduces competition, impacts price, and timetable. And adversarial relationships are born as each member of the supply chain tries to offset the impact of risk transfer. So, seems like a relatively simple solution, reduce and standardize the amendments, but nothing is ever as simple as it seems. So after the research phase, we found that there are nearly 100 core amendments. And to translate these all into the standard forms of building contracts, NEC, JCT, PPC 2000, would be a long and arduous affair. And we know at CCS and in government that we have a lot of paperwork. So do we want to publish a clunky Bible of amendments that are difficult to use and unappealing for our customers, especially to those in the wider public sector with less commercial experience? So the outcome of this would inevitably be that the Bible would be ignored along with the amendments and customers would revert back to their old habits. So in line with the simplification and standardization, we want to encourage our customers to use the contracts in their purest forms and limit the use of amendments to by exception. So what are we proposing? Standard boilerplate amendments. And in a joint project with IPA and David Hancock, there you are, we'll be producing a list of standard boilerplate amendments. These 20 amendments will focus on issues such as fair payment, confidentiality, security, GDPR, requirements that we believe are core to government bodies and departments. And I like to think of it as a pick and mix option. So the customers will lift the clauses relevant to them, but they will be pre-drafted, standard, unambiguous, and using simple and clear language. Recently, I've been engaging with some lawyers, and I found a quote that made me laugh. I hope there are no lawyers in the room.
Hands up.
Contracts are written by lawyers for lawyers in the expectation of litigation. Now, as we know, NEC was written by engineers and contractors for engineers and contractors in line with principles of flexibility, clarity and simplicity, and stimulus to good management. So why add amendments that contradict all three? Our hope is that the standard boilerplate amendments will reduce inappropriate risk transfer, promote good contract management, because as we know, the contracts set the tone for the entire project. Now, I will hand back to Kevin, and he will discuss how we will implement this list.
Thank you, Katie. So, as I mentioned, two large frameworks. In terms of values, there was quite a bit of excitement when we launched the prior information notice for the construction one that had a notation value of 30 billion. That is around about 3 billion per annum, so about 10% of public sector spend on construction. Modular buildings, we're probably in the order of £150 million per annum on that one. We're then going to follow it with off-site commercial agreements, but we need to do some work on that to make sure that we get the demand pipeline going, because value for money is a key component of increasing use of off-site. So we're using a framework alliance contract. We've trialled the use of it on our project management frameworks. The very good thing is that we are getting feedback from the market on good and bad practice for commissioners of project managers, cost consultants and architects, and would expect the very same from people appointed to the construction works framework. And what we are going to be doing is having the MI, so that if there is any bad practice that is going around, we can address it, and we can also see how far the government construction strategy and Building a Safer Future, or the Hackett report, is also being rolled out and improving client leadership. NEC, JCT, PPC, all available to use under the framework, and as Katie mentioned, really importantly, unamended forms. And just to reiterate the point, we really hope that the Tier 1s and Tier 2s adopt our lead and go for unamended forms of subcontract. And I think that is it from me. Thank you.
Thank you.